We're sitting down with Celyeste Power, who is the, well, not new anymore, but new-ish CEO and president of IBC, which is the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Celyeste, it's been about a year now since you took over, because I remember a year ago, I did this interview with Don Forgeron, and he was talking about retirement. So how's your congratulations, and how's your first year on the role of heading IBC been?
I'm loving it so far. I think it's been a great first start to the year.
Yeah.
The insurance industry has certainly its share of challenges that are facing us from, external factors, climate change, technological advancement, a very heavy regulatory agenda and growing regulatory environment. But it makes everything that we do very interesting, and it's been great to work with the industry on these important issues.
So IBC, unlike a lot of the provincial associations and trade associations, is very specific to representing all insurers. It's a come one, come all sort of thing if you want to be a member, and you represent things on a oversight kind of higher level. And that means regulating for all people in the industry. If you look at certain of the trade associations, they're very more specific to certain channels within the industry. When you look at every one of the members in IBC and the concerns and all the things that are spoken about, brought forward, are you seeing certain trends that are unified across all members? And is there consensus things on some of the issues facing the industry? And what are those key things that your members are talking about?
Yes, so certainly the big key issues that resonate with every single one of our members is climate and disaster risk, and making sure that we're prepared both as a country and as an industry, and that our customers are prepared for the changing climate that we're seeing. That's from building more resilient communities to making sure that there's a flood insurance program available so that anyone, regardless of where they live, can access affordable flood insurance, to also making sure that we have a backstop in place for the big quake that unfortunately we talk about it, and that is likely to happen at some point in our lives. The other aspect that is very unifying across our membership is the regulatory environment. There's been a shift, certainly with regulators across the country, and in Ottawa, the regulatory environment is growing. OSFI alone has increased its regulatory consultations by threefold. And we heard today from Peter Rutledge that he has no intention of slowing down. And so we're really making the case that we need to take a bespoke approach, a measured approach, predictable approach to the regulatory environment.
I have spoken with Peter Rutledge today, and we had a great conversation around some of those things, and particularly things that keep us up at night, like the big quake. And as it came up in conversation, Peter and I are both from the same neck of the woods in Vancouver. Somehow we don't seem to know similar people, but it was very odd to find that out. And we do share that issue around the big quake and what that means. What does that mean, given some of the certain economic headwinds that we're facing, particularly in BC? We're on the verge right now of having a housing meltdown, depending on whose forecast you're looking at, where there is a bubble bursting, particularly in the high value areas like a Toronto and a Vancouver. What does that mean for the Insurance Bureau and the members who are providing insurance out there? Are they concerned about what would happen when there's so much equity tied up in a home, yet very little equity outside the home ownership, and what would happen even paying deductibles?
Yeah, so earthquake is a big issue for the industry because it's a big issue for the customers. We're worried about, in case of that big event, do people have the right levels of coverage? Do they have coverage at all? Do they understand the deductible levels? But also from an industry perspective, if the big quake happens, we could see some failures, and we don't want to see that. We want to be prepared for it. Yeah. The industry is doing all that they can to do so through reinsurance and whatnot, but there's more that we can and should do. If you look at Canada, there's earthquake risk right across the country.
There is.
And in Eastern Canada, there's very little take-up of earthquake insurance. And in Western Canada, the industry could be, if they sold it as much as probably people would want, there could be some overexposure there. And so we want to work with the federal government. So we're building up the flood insurance program now, the National Flood Insurance Program. We want to work with the federal government to shift that to be a multi-peril program to provide that program for earthquake risk as well. And so that would look like, insurers taking up to a certain level of the threshold, and then, government loans and backstops to make sure that the industry can survive, and that most importantly, Canadians can have the coverage they need following the big quake.
So, Celyeste, obviously I have an interest, because I'm originally from Vancouver, I understand the big quake, but I do live in Manitoba. And I've experienced a number of floods there, and the largest flood that's ever happened was back in 1997, the flood of the century, which primarily hit a lot of farmland.
but that impacts people in the same way that it would in an urban center. You can't produce food, you have different economic challenges. Being as part of the Insurance Brokers Association of Manitoba and president at the time, we did a lot of lobbying with our provincial government around that, because at that point in time, it was the 4th flood in about 6 years that had happened in the spring. And we went to the government and we said, how can you be a part of this? And refreshingly enough, they said, we see ourselves as the reinsurer. So as you just outlined about that, is that a consensus that other provincial governments and regulators are considering in the model that you want to work with the federal government? Will provincial governments have a stake in this, or will it always go back to the federal government?
So Manitoba is actually a really good example of a province that built up a lot of resiliency to deal with the flooding that it sees, almost every year.
Yep.
Unfortunately, with our changing climate, now more and more communities, more and more provinces are seeing those levels of flooding that we have not seen previously. And ultimately, it was going back to the federal government to be paid for, because there was not insurance available until about 10 years ago, and now even still, it's limited take up there. Ultimately, it was going back to the federal government to backstop, essentially, through the DFAA program. And the parliamentary budget officer a few years ago said, this is not sustainable. Without a better program in place, we won't be able to continue to pay for these floods year over year over year. So this national flood insurance program that the federal government has announced that they'll be implementing is going to essentially do, as you mentioned, bring the provinces along and the federal government to get together and better understand how they can offer flood insurance to those in the highest risk areas. Insurance industry is going to continue to offer flood insurance to 90% of Canadians it's available to. But for that 10%, those living in that flood zone, there will be, sort of a government program there to support them. Details are still being worked out. But another critical piece of this is it can't just be we expect either the insurance industry or the government to continue to pay for these flooding events year over year. We need to make some tough decisions in how we build communities and how we build back communities. And that means no longer building in floodplains, doing strategic retreat where necessary, building up those dams where we need, and getting flooding information and mapping out to all Canadians. And so this all needs to be part, I believe, of a program to make sure it's successful moving forward.
So with flood, we can't retroactively go and re-engineer some of the things we have in floodplains. It would be taking away communities and such. But what about going forward? Canada is in a housing crisis for a lot of reasons. That's a whole other political issue. But let's talk about the number of homes. And we know we have initiatives across the country by all stakeholders in government to build more homes, to find more houses for people, affordable housing. Are we looking forward to where those homes are going to be and what they have to do to be climate and flood resilient? Is that part of how you're helping drive things forward? And how many people have to be involved in that? Because I'll throw them under the bus right now. Developers are a little more profit-centric than environmental-centric in their needs and how they go about things. Is more regulation and stuff going to help us build houses? Or are we still going to have those sort of trouble points with the people who build them versus what we need to build to be resilient?
So we absolutely need to keep climate top of mind when we're talking about our housing crisis and responding to our housing crisis. I actually just joined a bipartisan task force on housing and climate, and it's looking at that big question of how do we build this much housing affordably with our climate goals in mind, both from a mitigation standpoint and ESG standpoint, but also from an adaptation standpoint. And so we need to have that top of mind moving forward. We shouldn't be building on floodplains anymore, because at the end of the day, someone is paying for it. It's either the taxpayer, the policyholder, someone is going to be paying for that. And so we want to make sure that that message is loud and clear in all governments' minds as they're looking at solving this housing crisis. We want to solve it with them, but let's do so in a way that is sustainable so that we can build these homes that will last for years and years, and not on floodplains and other areas that we've seen.
So to date, are there successful changes that have happened that you can cite where we can say, hey, this was a model community that survived some climate change loss or perils And can you cite any of them and share where that's happened?
Absolutely. So High River, as you may recall,
Oh,
this
yes.
was one of the big flooding events many, many years ago. One of my close friends is from there, devastating for her family and the community. And when they were coming out of it, they looked around and said, well, what can we do? We're High River, there's flooding.
Yeah.
But the flooding's getting worse, and it's getting to a point that it is quite devastating. And they did a lot of resiliency measures, from strategic retreat to building dams, to make sure that they're protecting their community as much as possible. That is a very good model to look at. And when you're looking at building back and you're looking at these communities after, what can we do to improve them? Unfortunately, there are other examples where, and I won't name them specifically, but there are other examples where we had a big fire and we said, if you build back in this area, it's on a floodplain, and we're not going to be able to provide flood insurance since it's on the floodplain, so perhaps we could move them. And there were some challenges in the community, and they did not move them. And 3 years later, the whole community was flooded. That's where we need to make sure the right information is out there, education is there, to make sure, because those families had to go through it twice. They lost their home to a fire, they lost their home to a flood. And while no one wants to leave their community, when we have those opportunities, we need to be making the right decisions and making sure that people have the right information in their hands.
So this is maybe more of a social question, and you may not be able to answer it, but as an industry, and I'm speaking of all channels in it, whether it's companies, whether it's distribution, the broker, agent side of things, all parts of it, are we making a good enough effort to educate our customers, regular Canadians who need insurance, which is basically everyone, about the challenges and things going forward and how they have to look at insurance to manage these things? Because eventually it comes down to them. And a lot of times, and I know this from being on the broker distribution side, they're very resistant to change because they don't believe insurance is a true product, because hopefully they never use it. It's not a passion product. It's a product built out of, that's purchased out of duress because you need it or required to have it for lending requirements and such. So they have a hard time adjusting to change for it. So should we be doing more?
So I think the industry is doing a great job, through its various distribution networks, of making sure that people understand that, things are changing, risks are changing, and we're reassessing for these risks and trying to get, available products out there. Can we do a better job in educating Canadians in general as an industry, as a society? I think so. Financial literacy is quite low in Canada. It has been for a very long time. And I think we as an industry have a role to play in that, but I think governments have a role to play in that. All these different stakeholders do. And we find the more financially literate folks are, the more that we can work together to get out information on both financial information, but also on climate, the better decisions consumers make. So I think we're doing a pretty good job on it. Can we do better as an industry and as a society? Yes, absolutely we can. The challenge with the product we're selling, as you mentioned, you buy it in hope that you never use it.
Exactly.
And so when we're at the point of sale, and I'm not a broker, but I can imagine when you're at the point of sale, no one wants to think about having to use it. So as I mentioned today in my speech, no one really likes insurance that much. No one wants to think about insurance until they need insurance. And then they love having the sense of relief. They love understanding that they're protected, unless there's confusion on what's covered and what's not. So I think there's always a better job that we could do there, and I think the industry is doing a lot, but I think we as a society sort of need to do more to make sure that we're getting that message out, because it's not a message people want to receive until something bad happens.
Celyeste, thank you so much. Don't want to go on anymore. That was so succinct and a natural wrap. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of NICC. We know it's always going to be a good time. Lots of exciting things tomorrow on day 2. And great sitting down with you for the first time, and hope we can do it again.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.